Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this important public discussion. The Bones Are Speaking, a community-led discussion on the return of human remains. My name is Wilhelmina O'Connor, and I'm the Collections Manager for Archaeology here at Iziko. And I'll be chairing this session today. We are grateful that you could all attend. To open the event, I would like to welcome Ms. Ruxana Omar, the CEO of Iziko Museums of South Africa. Welcome, Ms. Omar.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry, I'm not sure whether my internet connection is a bit frazzled, but good afternoon to everyone who has joined us here on this glorious Heritage Day. And those who have joined the Iziko Museums Inherit Festival. And a warm welcome as we engage in this critical discussion before us today. The Bones Are Speaking, a community-led discussion on the return of human remains. My sincere thanks to the panel of experts and artists who are assembled here and who are greatly invested in this conversation. They offer us their knowledge and their time from around South African inside Iziko Museums. Many thanks to Diana Ferris, South African writer, poet, and storyteller of mixed Khoisan and slave ancestry, and who, with her poem, I've Come to Take You Home about Sarah Baartman, is widely recognized as the starting point for the return of Sarah Baartman's remains to South Africa. Jeffrey Uarasa, a Khoi language, culture, and heritage activist, who is also a poet, a rapper, and uses these mediums to elevate Khoi culture. Renee Stander, Deputy Director, International Conventions and Legislation in the National Department of Sport, Arts and Culture. Charlene Houston, a community-centered activist historian who has led pioneering processes relating to the reinternment of human remains. Robin Humphreys, a PhD archaeology student at the University of Cape Town, who is focused on radically changing archaeological practice in South Africa. Annelies Kotze, who works at the Iziko Museums of South Africa and who is currently doing her master's in archaeology at the University of Cape Town, focusing on cultural identity in Khoi, San, and colored women and indigeneity. Tariq Jenkins, who is the chairperson of the Ekara Restorative Justice Forum and one of its founding members. It is especially apt on Heritage Day that we have this conversation, because the matter of repatriating human remains continues to be a deeply painful and sensitive issue. And so not only must we reflect on it within its historical context, but also from a humanitarian perspective, institutions in South Africa. must stay attuned and ready to provide a platform for the conversation about how, why, when, and where the human remains of South Africans are repatriated to their community. But today and this weekend, I would also like to invite you to visit the Iziko Museums, where you may enter several of our museums for free. Iziko Museums not only holds in care and preserves artifacts, also offer an expansive window to the public on matters of scientific, historical, and cultural importance. The story of the enslaved arriving to these shores, contemporary art, discourse on the modern critical issues of today, natural history displays, scientific discoveries, and more. So, what I would like to do is to invite you to visit the Iziko Museums this weekend. Thank you once again for joining us, and to a wonderful and esteemed panel of guests. Happy Heritage Day, and I hope we have a dynamic seminar today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ahmad. Before we begin our program, a bit of housekeeping. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions and provide comment after our panelists have spoken. Please type your questions in the chat at any time. This Q&A session is limited to half an hour. To open our event, we would like to introduce Mr. Jeffrey Orasim. He is a Khoikhoi languages activist, poet, storyteller, and independent rapper who has been involved in numerous events linked to preserving language. He is even launching his own album called Freedom. He welcomes all of us here today with a poem. Over to you, Mr. Orasim.
Tavede, so greetings everybody. The first poem's name is Restorative Justice. Ska Hasan Tsansores Nige Kire Neba Afrika Oms Kip Hare Kong Kaka DDT Huipatere Moenie ons disrespect. Mama Sarah was die Tarasquest van beauty. Tsutsu Geho Govaba Kai Garo Sida Koisi Govahu Kusep Miba Gego Kwan Sada Skop Si Skop Ti Gasi Abogantia Kire Neba Ngaremap. Also, I have a second poem which is interlined with today. It's Heritage Day, and it's also about my own personal roots. The title of the poem is Namakai Skwenatia, or My People, the Nama Nation. Matisa Tikwena, Ngaremap Ukai, Sada di Namakais, Kawa Karado, Kaube Wan. Aunido Kau, Kaudu, Kavedu, Karudu, Kamado, Kami Nudu, I Usa Ngonsa, Kais Namakwena, Kumisa Dip, Rida Gaikan, Kakasan, Titake Ni, Nisa Mapatstia, Tamati Kangada Nasa Gera, Kais Sada. Tai ai kuitse tohoba huiba komisa geni koip.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Urasi. I'm so sorry I could not pronounce the new album, your album that you will be launching. Maybe if you can just pronounce that for us, please. I do know that the English word is called freedom.
And the title is Nora, Nora, Nora for freedom.
That's going to take a bit of practicing for me, but thank you so much. Okay, moving on. Okay, so the reason we are here today is to discuss growing community concern around human remains housed in museums and universities, including this museum. A lot of work is being done to help change the way human remains are being cared for in the hopes of future reburial, and there is much activism around providing information, community engagement, and developing process. We have gathered some notable speakers on these topics and hope it stimulates further open conversations. Due to unforeseen engagement, Regomotso Mokgedi cannot be with us today, and in his stead, he has asked Ms. Renette Stander to participate on his behalf. Ms. Stander is a Deputy Director for International Conventions and Legislation in the Heritage Policy Research and Development Directorate in the National Department of Sport, Arts and Culture. She started work in the heritage sector as a cultural officer and is today responsible for the ratification of international conventions as well as the development of national policy, including the national policy on the repatriation and restitution of human remains and heritage objects. Over to you, Ms. Stander.
Thank you so much. I know I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to be very quick. I'm going to talk to you today about the policy. We have developed a national policy for on the repatriation and restitution of human remains and heritage objects. This policy has been approved by Cabinet on the 16th of March, and we're very proud of it. It's been a very controversial policy. It's been a very difficult road for us. But basically, the problem statement that we had, the problems that we had, and the reason that we developed the policy was that we were, as South African government, we were inundated with requests to repatriate human remains in South African museums and university collections, as well as remains of South Africans in other countries. Efforts have been made by the national government to systematically identify liberation struggle heroes and heroines and repatriate their remains from foreign countries, as well as restitute back to families and communities remains of those buried elsewhere in the country. However, we didn't have a policy. So in the absence of the policy document or any guidelines and principles, the requests were being dealt with on an ad hoc basis, which were not a good thing. There was no consistency and lack of uniform approach in how these cases are dealt with by the key national departments. And then in terms of, we've also dealt with heritage objects, but I know that that's not why we are here today, so I'm not going to really talk about that. Now, the purpose of the policy is to provide the necessary framework to manage the ethical discovery, ethical curation, and possible restitution and repatriation claims, and the return of human remains, nationally as well as internationally. The scope of the policy is limited to human remains and heritage objects that are held in government-funded cultural institutions, as well as those in foreign countries. The policy therefore covers and provides a framework for repatriation and restitution of human remains and heritage objects, falling under the ambit of the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture, the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, and the Department of Military Veterans. It also deals with human remains of people that passed away during the wars of resistance, 1510 to 1910, the wars of disposition, also known as the 100-Year War of 1779 to 1880, the early liberation struggle period, and the late liberation struggle period. Repatriation and restitution of unethically collected human remains outside the borders of South Africa are also included, and restitution of unethically collected human remains in South African institutions, and then the repatriation or restitution of heritage objects in and outside the borders of South Africa. The policy also provides for the repatriation and restitution of human remains of military veterans and the repatriation of missing persons, which fall under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. There's a long implementation protocol. I'm not going to go through that with you. I'm just going to highlight a few sections. The policy provides a framework for national and provincial governments in conjunction with communities to initiate and implement restitution and repatriation of human remains and heritage objects in government-funded museums, cultural institutions, as well as universities within and outside the South African borders. Now, one of the most important parts here that I want to highlight is the words conjunction with communities, because without the communities, we cannot do anything with regard to repatriation. And then for the national sphere of government, the policy provides for South African government to develop through diplomatic relations and the 1970 Convention in particular, arrangements with foreign governments to repatriate and restitute human remains and heritage objects, which form South Africa's national memory and identity. The policy also provides a framework for provinces to initiate and implement restitution of human remains. Then for human remains held in privately funded institutions, the policy recommends that the state, on behalf of and/or together with the requesting individuals, families, or communities, enter into negotiations with the privately funded institutions or individuals for the restitution and repatriation of human remains. The costs for returning these human remains and heritage objects are borne by both the requesting state and the private institution. And then in case of restitution and repatriation of human remains and heritage objects from foreign countries, the provincial government concerned shall, in conjunction with the national government, make arrangements with the foreign government in question, as may be necessary for the return of human remains and heritage objects back to South Africa. Then I'm going to skip the rest of this. And then one very important part of this policy is that what it basically says is that we must conduct an inventory of human remains of victims of conflict and heritage objects and ethically collected human remains, and make arrangements with reciprocating states as may be necessary, and enter into an agreement in terms of the 1970 Convention for the return of these remains and heritage objects documentation to their country of origin. And then all South African citizens with bona fide interest may lodge a claim for restitution and repatriation. And then restitution and repatriation of remains shall be facilitated upon request by individuals, families, or communities. As I mentioned, this is a very important point for us, that communities are very much involved from the beginning of the repatriation process. The policy, however, acknowledges that there may be instances where repatriation is not possible and recognizes the rights of individuals, families, or communities who may prefer to leave human remains of their loved ones in foreign lands, or where foreign governments may, in consultation with the owners of human remains, request to preserve them in situ and create memorial parks around them. Another option that we have thought of was spiritual repatriation. So the policy also covers that. And then no graves shall be left open or unattended upon completion of repatriation projects. This is especially if we if we get human remains from overseas and they were already buried. Then, very important point is that the policy establishes the Repatriation and Restitution Office within the South African Heritage Resources Agency. The role of the RRO, as we call it, is to manage the procedures of repatriation and restitution of human remains and heritage objects. Then the policy expects the respectful treatment of human remains and heritage objects by everyone concerned, as well as the appropriate long-term management, whether that involves curation or reburial. Unethically acquired human remains must be identified, isolated, deaccessioned, and stored according to best practice until reburial is possible, with no access by the public. There's a moratorium on this now, and proactive steps should be taken to engage in restitution for unethically acquired human remains. Currently, we are in the process of establishing the RRO with SARA, the South African Heritage Resources Agency. And then also we have appointed an advisory committee that will assist the RRO in developing criteria for the who can claim, who should be repatriated and restituted, etc., and also to assist them in terms of practices, in terms of cultural practices when it's reburial, etc. So I thank you.
Thank you for that, Ms. Stander. This new national policy is something that will guide institutions who hold human remains, and that includes Iziko Museum. And in future, this is something that will benefit us all greatly. Okay, I now turn to our next speaker, Ms. Annelies Kotze, who currently works at Iziko. She is also busy completing her master's in archaeology, and this focuses on cultural identity in Khoi, San, and colored women. In 2018, Annelies did an exhibition on the return of human remains, particularly focused on the remains of women and children still housed in museums and universities. She has been involved in community engagement, both in her personal and professional capacity, and is passionate about an advocate for the importance of community engagement and decolonizing museum spaces. Over to you, Annelies.
Thank you, Wilhelmina. Am I allowed to share my screen, please? Okay, you can see it? Okay. Okay, so firstly, I acknowledge and pay respects to the spirits of the ancestors whose remains continue to be housed in museums and universities, and apologize to them that they remain there, unable to complete their journey into the world beyond. It is an honor to be sharing this platform with all of you today and to discuss the sensitive yet very necessary topic of human remains and the participation of communities therein. So my journey with the human remains in Iziko Museums started in 2017 when I assisted with the proceedings of the very first important Commonwealth Association of Museums conference on human remains. When Oma Katrina asked to say a prayer at the end of the conference where the human remains are kept, she asked me to accompany her. Going into that room for the first time, I felt a sense of familiarity, but also of pain. Seeing Oma look at the boxes and recognizing the places and dates and how she connected with them really struck a chord with me. The following year, I curated an exhibition called Interesting Times. What prompted me to do the exhibition was not only to uncover the dark past of the museum and what happened to those individuals in life and in death, but also to expose the dark memories communities have to deal with every day, and to seek a solution in an attempt to address this regrettable past. I make this statement as the human remains continue to be housed in the dark rooms of universities, my museum, and many other museums around the country and the world. The exhibition consisted of 2 rooms. The first room exhibited empty human remains boxes or replicas of the boxes, grave goods, as well as a replica of the human remains acquisitions register. The exhibition itself was dark with only strategic lights on specific objects. Upon entering the room, the visitors were presented with a lamp. So the idea behind the lamp was to allow the viewer to be part of the journey of bringing the dark secrets to light, the light they were carrying being both a metaphor and a physical light, to allow the awakening they were experiencing in the moment to be an act of their own doing. In the second room of the exhibition was the crate that housed the coffin, which contained the remains of Sarah Baartman during her repatriation to South Africa in 2002. The significance of her crate was its emptiness, a successful repatriation after a long struggle. Part of my attempt to restore dignity to the memory of Sarah Baartman was to have the poem of Diana Ferris, I Have Come to Take You Home, a tribute to Sarah Baartman, translated into Khoekhoegowab. Translating the poem into this language was to have her own the space, to have her own words of the pain and degradation she had to endure in life and in death. One of the most powerful comments about the exhibition was from a guest who attended the opening event, Mrs. Joy Varis, and I quote, "Going into that space and being exposed to what happened to the first people here, when the colonists came, their God complex, of thinking they were better and their inhumaneness of treating people as objects, that act of brutality, that act of inhumaneness of treating another human being. We as a people do not know much about our history. The exhibition was an exposure of what happened to the first people here in South Africa, and it was evidence of what was done. The little lamp was so potent in its power that it brought to the space. When I walked in there, I could hear the cries. I could hear the many questions of the first people. And to know that we are descendants of them and their cries have been silent for the whole time, just to be heard by certain people who are privileged to be in that environment, and the ignorance of us as a people." End quote. The main reason of me wanting to create this exhibition was to give a voice to those whose voices were taken away from them. Not only were they robbed of their voices, but of their language, their identity, and their humanity. They were treated as animals and as objects. When they were alive, they were not allowed to speak. They were not allowed to be human. They were not allowed to be proud of who they were. Their voices were taken away. And now that their voices have been eternally silenced, it is important to have their voices heard through their words, their cries, and the pleas of their descendants, for the bones have spoken. Government, scientists, and museums, myself included as an insider from the outside, feel like we have the right to speak on behalf of the bones, which are an object of the state. But what authority do we have to dissect, to research, to decide on how to keep these remains? Communities are consulted, but one has to also watch out for the opportunist who uses the bones as a commodity. But even amongst all of this toing and froing, you still find a living individual whose remains are housed in a museum and they don't even know it. They feel their pain, they hear their cries, but they don't know why. You still find living individuals who go into the room and recognize names on boxes, names of areas, and feel the pain. They are individuals who go into the room where the human remains are housed to offer a prayer and just to cry. Cry for what those individuals have gone through and for what they continue to go through. Cry because those individuals have gone through so much. Cry because tears need to be shed in a space filled with pain, violence, and loss. You have living individuals who sit in a meeting after all the politics and finances have been discussed and the fights die down, and when allowed the opportunity to speak, just say, "My heart is very sore. I just want to see my people buried. They need to rest." I've been to communities where people have asked to be consulted, to be educated about human remains, and to be informed as to what they can do and how they can teach their communities. I've been to communities where individuals are actively campaigning to have the remains of their ancestors buried, who look for advice, who look for guidance, and who look for a platform for their voices and concerns to be heard and understood. But these voices are drowned out by bureaucracy, by experts, and the commodification of the bones. We need to acknowledge the epistemic violence caused by museums and universities in the past, that it still has tangible effects on the communities to this day. I'm not romanticizing the fact that once the bones have been buried, that all will be right with the world and everything will be hunky-dory. Communities will still be fighting for basic needs and fighting for the injustices and trying to make a better life and future for their generations to come. Research will continue to be done, whether for scientific reasons or for repatriation, as is the case with the unethically collected remains, those that were collected for race-based science. But when research is done, take into consideration not just the science, but the soul and the spirit. We need to realize that we are all spiritual beings, and each spirit has a journey in life and in death, which it needs to fulfill. The practice of returning the bones to the earth is a process of completing the journey for us all, as we will also return to the earth one day. Healing comes from returning to the earth. This balance and passage needs to be respected and acknowledged. But the bones have spoken. And while those bones remain in boxes, the bones of their descendants walk the streets of Cape Town, in Sutherland, and Kuruman, and the Kalahari. They are the voices that should be listened to, not responded to with expert knowledge, but to be understood, to understand their loss, their yearning for closure, and their pain. Indigenous communities need to know that they have the right and authority to speak. It is their voices, their thoughts, their concerns, which should find its way into policies and procedures and ultimately into practice. The spirits of the ancestors are restless. The bones are and continue to speak. Their journeys need to be completed. Let this be a lesson for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Annelies. Okay, for the next few minutes, let us enjoy part of her moving poem, I Have Come to Take You Home, by Miss Diana Fedis, who unfortunately could not be here today, but provided this reimagined clip to help guide our conversations. Is home now, and she's free. Never again to be hunted, to be planted on foreign soil, there to grow, not as a human, but as a freak. Our ancestor is home now, and she's free. But there are bones in museums, stories in requiems. Our people's remains are like stains in human history. We cannot clean the cloth. The bones reappear, for the atrocity remains near. The bones have no fear. They
jump up. They are in our face, be it in Paris, be it at Prestwich. Let us accept that the human race has made this earth an evil place, but never again inflicted pain, never again an evil stain. Peace to our ancestors remains.
We would like to thank Ms. Fedders for sharing a poem with us today, even though she could not be here with us. Thank you. Okay, leading from this, let's welcome our next speaker, Ms. Robin Humphreys, who is busy with a PhD in archaeology. She is invested in radically changing archaeological practice in South Africa. She advocates for an accountable archaeology which acknowledges communities and community institutions as important stakeholders in managing human remains. Over to you, Robin.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen quickly. We just go to slideshow. So first of all, thank you for the invitation to share. And the title of my talk, Listening and Learning How Community Knowledge Has Shaped My Approach to Biological Anthropology. And for my PhD, I'm trying to think about how we can engage with communities as biological anthropologists regarding research on human remains from archaeological sites, and whether that is appropriate. And I'm looking at sites in Cape Town specifically. And the basis of my PhD thesis is Prestwich Burial Ground. And I think this is an important site when we think about the relationship between researchers and communities and human remains. It is an informal burial ground that was discovered during development in 2003. And for biological anthropologists, the site was an exciting site because of the number of individuals that were found at the site. There were 2,500 people, more than 2,500 people buried at the site, and they represented the underclasses of Cape Town. And the star is where the burial ground was discovered during development. However, there was a lot of contestation around the exhumation process. Community members intervened, and during the public consultation, they sort of advocated for keeping the burial ground intact, creating a memorial, and ensuring that there's a memorialization of the erased history of the enslaved, as well as the erased that this was a burial ground, as well as the history of forced removal in Greenpoint. And even though the community went through multiple appeals process to prevent the exhumation and development from occurring, they were not successful. However, I think the community's members made an important intervention because the human remains were exhumed. However, they were reinterred in Prestwich Place Memorial, which is a memorial in Greenpoint that is partly the product of community and heritage institutions working together to create this memorial. And the pink star is where you would find Prestwich Place Memorial if you sort of go on the fan walk. It's the first building you'll see as you enter Greenpoint. And this, I think, really resulted in a different relationship between biological anthropologists and human remains. And the priority was honoring these human remains, memorializing these human remains. And that's very different from what would have happened had there not been community intervention. And though the memorial is not as expansive as it could have been, it's still a contested site. I think it is an important space because it represents an opportunity for something else, a different way for communities to relate to human remains, and to have some control over what happens with human remains. And if you compare what happened to the human remains at Prestwich Street to those that were discovered at Coburn Street, which is where this yellow stripe is over here, there's been extensive research on those human remains from Coburn Street. And even though biological anthropology and archaeology advocates for research on the basis that we can tell people about their histories, a lot of that history is published in scientific journals. You don't see a lot of that heritage or that history being marked on the landscape. And if I think about today, Heritage Day communities are really out there making sure that they are sharing what they remember about places, sharing their histories, making those histories visible. And I think that's where biological anthropology fails, but what biological anthropology fails to do. So we're sort of saying we should have access to human remains because we're going to tell you something about the past, and yet that doesn't add to healing and justice in the way that Annalise sort of spoke about earlier. And initially when I started my project, I wanted to do ancient DNA research on the human remains. And I thought that after 15 years, there was space to engage with the community regarding research on some of the individuals at Prestwich Street Burial Ground. However, because the community was so frustrated, I really decided not to do that because I wanted to understand how after 15 years there had still been so much frustration and anger when it came to biological anthropologists, and why there was so much distrust. And I draw on different subdisciplines of archaeology that focus on the relationship with community and communities having control over their heritage, disciplines that acknowledge that often there is erasure of communities, marginalization, and the production of narratives that continue to create inferior stereotypes of community members. And I think what the community really, how the community intervened in terms of Prestwich Street is that it forced biological anthropologists to think about what it means to do research on human remains, especially given the history of biological anthropology and the collection of human remains, the race science that the discipline is associated with. And communities continue to be marginalized from human remains. And while scientists continue to do research on human remains, and science often reproduces racist narratives and continues to use those categories that were produced, there's not much difference between the discipline in the past and the present. And some might argue with me about that. And I think communities really require biological anthropologists to critically think about what we're doing and how we're contributing to the world. And often that's very difficult. And the Prestwich Street contestation really helped me to think about whether it is appropriate to do research on human remains, given the history of collecting people and making them objects, and especially since these people were the enslaved and indigenous communities. And I think if anyone understands what these individuals who can't speak for themselves might want for themselves, it would be their descendants who continue to live with the consequences of colonialism and apartheid, and are continually dealing with being marginalized. We have gentrification, we have people being moved out of their homes, and they understand what it means not to be valued in society. And I think they are the people that we should be listening to in terms of what is the appropriate decision to make about whether there should be research on human remains. And communities advocated for memorialization and making histories visible in Greenpoint, and that should be the priority, and not continued research on those human domains with the information ending up in scientific journal articles. And also communities have important knowledge in terms of using these sites, using these moments as moments for dialogue and connecting communities who have been marginalized from the histories to their histories, and creating space for healing and justice and liberation. And I think that community intervention and listening to communities and really engaging with the work that they have been doing has really shifted my research approach and what my priorities are in terms of what I want to achieve, and whether it's really necessary for me to do research on human domains, or whether that will even add value for communities, or whether we need to prioritize returning human domains, and really reckoning with our history as the discipline of biological anthropology. And I just want to say thank you to my funders, my supervisors, and community members. And Iziko for inviting me.
It's very interesting to see how Prestwich Place and the memorialization of those individuals are viewed so differently by so many stakeholders, and the need for community engagement. Thank you so much for that, Robin. Keeping the focus on provincial work, I now introduce Micheline Houston. She is a community-centered activist historian. She has led pioneering processes relating to the reinterment of human remains. Her input draws on her own practical experience in the challenging and complex process, and her insights as a former manager in the Western Cape Government's Museum Service. Over to you, Ms. Houston.
Thank you, Chairperson, or shall I say Gangans, and good afternoon, or Gaitzis, to everybody joining us today. I want to thank my colleague, Renette Stander, Kaiser Gangans, Renette, for that overview of the policy, a long-awaited, much welcomed policy, indeed. But before I continue, I would like to invite everybody to join me to pause just for a moment. We'll only take a moment. Let us pause on this Heritage Day and imagine our beautiful land, a scene of freedom, a scene where children are born and everyone is free, treasured and loved as they grow, free to be, free to cherish and be cherished as they mature into adulthood. The men in this land secure in who they are, safe, self-respecting, and giving love. The women, the non-binary, and the children all safe, rooted, cherished, self-respecting, and giving love. Imagine. And so it is. As I began to say, the policy has been much anticipated. And finally, here we are at the point where we can consider what this policy means for our institutions, and in particular, what it means for South African museums and universities who are still in possession of ancestral remains. The policy's got a material or practical significance, but it's also of symbolic importance. Symbolically speaking, we as a nation have finally set ourselves the objective of making right with the restless spirits of our missing and our dead. With Abu Khan, or ancestors who, from as far back as the early 19th century, were violently disturbed from their resting places. Not a moment too soon, this is the first policy to explicitly address the ongoing unresolved trauma of those missing and dead bodies, and of people, of communities unable to exercise our cultural rights in respect of those bodies. So that is what the policy, the opportunity that the policy presents to us. It presents to us this moment in our history to make right. Now the policy, as was mentioned earlier by Renette, deals with various categories: missing persons, military veterans, the victims of conflict from early colonial days and more recent conflicts, and those unethically collected remains. And today I'm just focusing on the last category, the victims of early conflicts and the unethically collected remains. The policy sets the tone for how this making right must happen with the Abogan, with the ancestors. It creates a framework of repatriation and restitution. Now, restitution quite literally means a return to the legitimate owners. And repatriation involves return, again, once more, to a country or a group based on ethical considerations. So terms like these and other words in the policy, like healing, reconciliation, closure, dignity, these are all words you'll find in the policy. They signal a particular orientation, a particular set of values, a particular spirit behind this policy. What does it imply in practice? So the sections of the policy are obviously written for the various categories of persons, missing persons and dead bodies. So they might mean different things in practice for those different categories, but today we're focusing on those unethically collected remains. There are 3 scenarios discussed in the policy. There is those remains that are held in government-funded institutions, our museums and universities mostly. There are those held in private-funded institutions, and then of course those in foreign countries. So the policy immediately creates an environment of partnership and collaboration, because it has finally enabled government to come on board alongside the communities who have for so long been calling and requesting for repatriation, for spiritual repatriation, and for reburial. Now, universities and museums are also put in a position where they have to be partners, collaborators alongside descendant communities. This means working together. The policy talks about the appropriate handing over of the remains with the utmost respect. These are words in the policy. It requires ongoing interaction with communities as the process unfolds. So this means we should see an end to the often self-serving processes that we've seen our institutions design when they do finally tackle the remains in their custody. Should mean an end to a tone of distrust and tension as we all gather around remains, and should create more of an environment of respect and dignity, more fitting for a reburial process or a repatriation process. So now within this framework, we should see harmony led by the office Renette referred to, the Office of Repatriation and Restitution. The policy on the institutions to become proactive. These institutions now need to identify descendant communities or families where such exists. These institutions must now notify communities of everything associated with the remains and the history of the remains and any documentation associated with the remains, as well as any objects associated with the remains. These communities must now, in terms of the policy, be allowed access to all information on record. Speaking of being proactive still, government is expected to initiate negotiations where such is necessary, to lead negotiations or mediate in the interest of finding common ground. The government-funded entity or the museum or the university should be funding such processes. There are also management implications for the remains. They must be deaccessioned immediately. This is an important step in taking the remains from the status of being objects in a collection to being the remains of dead bodies. It's a process of the rehumanization of those remains. Then the policy requires that those remains be appropriately stored until the future is decided. Inventories must be made so that all can know how much remains there are, what remains there are, what the background is to those remains. And this also means an end to this tendency of separating the cultural objects, the grave goods, the funerary objects from the bodies. The policy also has implications for research and is finally a statement about how research and under which conditions and for which ends research can be undertaken. It's no longer going to be up to a scientist to twist the arm of someone in charge. An advisory committee now has to make a decision at the place where the remains are held, places which we will be calling repositories. Only repositories assigned by this office will be allowed to hold remains. Applications for research must go through the advisory committee of a particular repository. And if it's unethically collected remains, research is only likely to take place if it is part of the process of restitution. And where this happens, it will have to also be subject to the permission of the community or the family concerned. Coming to Robin's discussion on Prestwich Place, it is a relief to see that the policy now also sets out very clearly how to deal with the accidental discovery of remains going forward. We can rest assured now that curators and researchers will no longer be the happy recipients of dead bodies as they were in the 70s and the 80s still. No, the bones have spoken and they are being heard. From here on, accidental discoveries will be treated as with respect and dignity as deserved. They will be placed in repositories and their future decided collectively, as I've explained earlier on. From here on, our dead will be treated with respect should they be disturbed. This is very, very exciting news. I find great pleasure in sharing with you on this Heritage Day. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Houston. It is clear that much more discussion and consultation is required to resolve how we as heritage practitioners navigate issues around human remains, and communities need to be included far more in what we do with and how we handle human remains, which are kept in museums and universities. Okay. Finally, I would like to introduce Mr. Tariq Jenkins, who is a convener of the Anti-Repression Working Group of the C19 People's Coalition and an accredited monitor for the South African Human Rights Commission. As chair of the Ngada Restorative Justice Forum, based at the Center for African Studies of Cape Town, he convenes the commissions on sacred human remains, land, and C19. He is the High Commissioner of the Goring-Haikona Khoikhoi Traditional Indigenous Council and involved in various civic, heritage, and environmental structures, including the Observatory Civic Association, the Two Rivers Urban Park Association, and the Civic for Action in Public Participation. He holds an MFA, School of the Arts, Columbia University, an alumnus of the International Fellows Program, School of International Public Affairs, Columbia University. He is a PhD, Mafeje Scholar at the Center for African Studies at the University of Cape Town. Over to you, Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you very, very much. I just want to take this moment to acknowledge and really say thank you to all the speakers so far for this really moving engagement that we have today. In the 10 minutes that I have, I would maybe want to explore a few questions that I think could move on to particular aspects of discussion, which I think could be of benefit in terms of the broader dialogue of the repatriation and restitution of sacred human remains. I think that within the Thai Restorative Justice Forum, and as far as questions around public engagement, meaningful participation, agency, and power, and the extent to which institutional and scientific specialists and experts can influence communities while navigating descendant communities into the reintroduction sometimes of accessioning levels of trauma, and one of the things that I think we ought to look at in terms of how the current policy document can be translated in its actual manifestation at a community level is to also take a look at the relationships that particular institutions have had in this country, and we've spoken about that a lot today. The science expedition, for example, against orality. I think when we talk about ritual, and ritual in the context of the University of Cape Town, for example, has seen a number of events of ritual returning to campus. The name change from Jameson Hall to Sarah Bartman ushered boldly to the country and to the world the intentions of transformation and restorative justice within the context of the university, but also was bound by a particular terms of reference, that the name change itself would not just be limited to that, but that it would form part of a much deeper, layered and structural intervention of transformative change. And I think laced with this complex kind of recognition, and especially when we look at the coalface of when communities now are having to engage with sacred human remains, and the complex hybrid of religious practices, which on the one hand seem to grapple both worlds of a colonial past and societies that have ostensibly been completely stripped from language and from a whole range of indigenous forms of cultural practice because of the degrees of ethnocide that that have taken place. So the context of authentic ritual, and I think the dangers of essentializing this, and the need for an open, flexible, participatory way of allowing communities to determine how ceremonies will take place is important. However, within that, it all boils down again, questions of specificity and questions of consent. What is consent? What is consent in terms of how a fallen ancestor will want, their body to be examined, and even in the context of a repatriation, or under the guise or the intention of the dignity of burial. What are the kinds of measures that have to be taken place, in securing that the commodification and the spectacle of repatriation is tightly within, I think, the thinking of the policy that's not being espoused. One thing which is absent is the fact that we cannot speak about the dignity of our ancestors and the repatriation and restitution of our ancestors, where as a country we have not acknowledged sites of Holocaust, sites of genocide, that there has not been a full recognition of the fact that genocide did take place, and that definitions of massacre and mass murder are things that have been, juggled and toyed around with, for a while, in terms of, how certain historians would want to place the history of our country. And in the same way that we would acknowledge sacred human remains and ancestors, in particular, who fought in these wars against colonial aggression, the acknowledgement of this fact is very important, because it provides a backdrop, a very important systemic and both psychological and spiritual framework around which we begin to acknowledge the burgeoning histories of the past. And so I think that, with this kind of restorative justice also needs to be accompanied with, for example, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the San and Khoi, where we begin to look at the dispossession of land in its first instance in 1657 on the banks of the Liesbeek River, when the title deeds were given to the Dutch East India Company to its employees, the Freeburger farmers, which then precipitated into it resulted in the First Frontier War in 1659, which precipitated over 16 more wars of liberation and resistance over 180-year period that resulted in the genocide. We begin to look at the trajectory of dislocation and displacement without losing thread of places and spaces where these kinds of atrocities have been committed. And I think when we begin to locate these areas, and this is where the intersectional importance of memorialization in appropriate ways, also begin to locate areas of resistance in a particular way that can broaden up a national narrative of recognition and respect, in as far as descendant communities are concerned, that today have ostensibly also been divorced of Africanness. So-called colored identity complexes have rendered the relationship with the symbiotic relationality of indigenous communities like the San and Khoi have been rendered oblique, and that the concrete jungles of the sort of concentration camps of apartheid spatial planning, for example, of the Cape Flats, is really the kind of essential reworking of a relationship with concrete as Mother Earth. And so how do we also begin to invest in our broader educational programming, the dignity of loss, and and in areas where violence is at its heightened because of a particular sort of fault line of apartheid history that we experience still within this reality. And as a monitor for the SHRC, C19, the pandemic has put ends on the fault lines of apartheid spatial planning. And I think that how we move forward in bringing together the unsilencing of particular realities around genocide and massacre will augment, I think, how our ancestors are returning home. That our ancestors are returning home in a place where their struggles are struggles and are truly acknowledged at a national and international level. So I think just to end off my contribution, it was very difficult for me, I think also within the space of time, to want to talk about some of the repatriation processes that we've been doing at the University of Cape Town. But there is a poem that was written that talks to a southern repatriation process where sacred human remains were unearthed at the health science department at the University of Cape Town, and that has prompted a process of repatriation, which has opened up a whole range of I think of deeper thinking in as far as how we address these particular processes. So this piece is called Steering for Steerman. Tomorrow is a moment where the skeleton will come out of the department's tomb. We will do a ceremony of remembrance. Mpepo is planned to burn, prayer will be prayed, a koi church of contradiction from Christ to Tahan. Remains will become human again. Tonight, the president will give us the message. Snipers have lined the bridge, barricades are in place. It's a military operation that presupposes words of a speech of a man, a pencil test of surety. The world watches tonight. In the theater tomorrow after dark, Kotoa will have an invocation under sonar lights of a place once called Nikomalan. The stage will gleam with the prose of a voice once forgotten. In Dutch, Riebeck will utter his reasons for living. In Afrikaans, this actress will move in and out of Koikovab. This landscape is a light from the church today. The children of that guard evacuate. Camps Bay burns so close to the water and will smolder the headlines. But the Lisbeek still flows through its clogged pipe of 87 centimeters, where the silt builds up till it's renewed, but its slow movement, pain to reflect the face of the embankments, whose riveted furrows remain the lines that bind us to the memory of this place. Observatories declared National Heritage Site, but no mention of bones, of skulls, of skin, of eyes that met stars on that mound. Steerman will kiss this cheek from the catacomb of the health science building. My hands tremble, and the shudder of this thought will take me back to the Conference of Rivers. I will cast stone and spare no quarter. We will hold the line, furrow, and the dissidents who reek among us, like cadaverous chameleons, will feel the cracked heat of the sun and kneel down for forgiveness before entering the trunk of that tree where elephants go to their final resting place, where the heaviest have tread and fallen. Rest now among the horns and be silent in the reverence of this place, the place where the stars and the storm clouds gather. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jenkins. I'm sure everyone would agree that acknowledgement and restorative justice are of paramount importance to these conversations going forward. I would like to thank all our speakers for introducing a number of topics. I now open the discussion to our audience and welcome questions or comments. And if we can please just, we will try to answer as many questions as possible within our allocated time. Okay, so I have a question from Chief Steerman, and this is directed at Mr. Jenkins. Okay, good afternoon. Can you please clarify why is the 2018 and 2019 media briefings conflicting each other? In the 2018 version, there were 4 Steedmans according to the archival records of C.G. Coetzee, but in 2019, there were only 1 Steedman. The second question, why do UCT choose to ignore the Eastern Cape claim to have DNA studies be done as they already violated the remains and had DNA studies done without our consent that has divided our family in the whole process? Maybe we can just, the first one. So I can repeat the first question. So that's 2 questions from Chief Steerman. So it's, good afternoon. Can you please clarify why is the 2018 and 2019 media briefings conflicting each other? In the 2018 version, there were 4 Steermans, according to the archival records of C.G. Coetzee, but in 2019, there were only 1 Steerman.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think that the issue of the repatriation of sacred human remains in terms of the engagement of 3 families, of Steerman families, has also opened up a sort of a range of differing opinions from, or split opinions from the families in terms of what is appropriate and what is ethical. And as far as the contradiction on the media brief that you are referring to, I can't answer to that. That was a media brief that was coming in from the group of academics and researchers and scientists that were assigned to that phase of the repatriation of the process. But we can certainly take that up as a formal question to the working group, certainly we can we can follow up on that one. But I certainly do not have the knowledge right now to give a correct answer there for that. Perhaps we could maybe go to the second question, if you wouldn't mind repeating that.
Okay, just reading the second question. I'm sure that maybe Robin or Annelies can also just give their input here. So the second one is why does UCT choose to ignore the Eastern Cape's claim to have DNA studies done as they already violated the remains and had DNA studies done without our consent that has divided our family in the whole process?
Okay. So I think in terms of the DNA, I mean, this has always been, I think this is a bone of contention. I know that with the Clara Restorative Justice Forum and sort of our engagement with with the university on orality versus a science expedition, and the fact that DNA testing can be very sort of problematic. I think the answer there was that it was the community that that wanted to know more about the family. So there were other kinds of assessments that were made as well, you know, in terms of facial recognition, and other forms of research analytical practice that would determine, you know, a lot about the sacred remains and how they lived, and especially how they, you know, how they died. In fact, you know, that was a very important request as well from the communities, and that was answered in terms of that particular community engagement. One of the big ethical debates at the moment is whether or not DNA is something that should be encouraged when it comes to wanting to find out, you know, about one's sort of the extent of one's cultural affinity, because it does lend itself to a particular set of ethical challenges, which also speak to issues of race science, and the whole argument of DNA versus communities that have a particular cultural assertion and agency is an ongoing debate. So there are definitely some ethical questions there that I think are very sort of are very delicate. And so, for example, you would find that farmers in Grabouw or out in the northern Cape who deem themselves as Afrikaners, white Afrikaners, may have DNA of a very strong sort of a very strong level of DNA linked to San and Khoi. Does this then mean that you know, that community will assert that DNA sample as now a form of co-opting or entering as custodians of the San and Khoi as an example? And so I think you know, there are a number of very serious ethical questions around the rationale behind sort of DNA, when it is appropriate and when it isn't appropriate, and I'm sure that this is a question that that we should open to perhaps having a full on public sort of debate on. But I think that you know, the university has been quite sort of clear in terms of its, you know, its particular position on that ethically. But I think you know, Robin will be able to jump in here. I think you know, she has some very good insight along those lines, and so you know, maybe I can hand the rest of that question over to you, Robin.
Hello,
Okay,
I just
Robin.
wanted to contribute in terms of just saying, I don't know what the DNA test results. I'm not sure if the universities released the DNA test results for the individuals that were in the collection, but I do think that what it speaks to is, and I'll put my hand up because I just want to say, as we have new policies, I think we just need to be honest that as scientists, we are very invested in accessing genetic information, accessing data before the video, right? And I think that these individuals, there was a descendant community and there was a family, but I think also these questions impact many people, and I think there should be broad consultation. And I think when we only have particular, like, I think also we should try and make these processes as open as possible, so that as many people as possible who feel connected to the human remains can be engaged with meaningfully, and they can be involved in making important decisions such as the genetic research. And I think that there needs to be transparency around that. I think I'm not sure what happened with the UCT, I'm not sure what they said with regards to not doing the genetic research. or not comparing different families to the individuals that they did do the genetic research on. But I do think that there needs to be transparency about the results, and why they chose to do particular things. And I think with the new policy, when we work with communities, there needs to be transparency about who the communities that we are working with, and we need to be open to having multiple communities and multiple family members participate in the process, because I think there's an opportunity to also reproduce that ownership of the human remains through aligning yourself with family members. And I'm not saying that's what happened at UCT, but I'm just saying that that is what could happen, because ultimately we could change the policy, but if science as a discipline doesn't change, and we continue to believe that we have the right to human remains and we have the right to research, we will find ways to do that. And that's my contribution.
Okay, Ms. Houston, I see your hand is up, so you will be next, and then Dr. Kasibe, and then Renette Stander.
Yes, thank you, Chairperson. I mean, the UCT issue is quite a complex one, but it's also interesting in the sense that the community has agreed to whatever testing was done in recent times. I think we must take the opportunity while we have Ms. Stander here from the National Office to ask her what, because basically what the situation here is that it is not abiding with the policy. We have a policy and it's being ignored. There is a bone of contention, if you pardon the pun, around where some of the remains at UCT must be buried. And there's a bloodline descendant, a royal house, who's asking for DNA testing to put the matter to rest. So this fits within the ambit of what the policy says is totally permissible when it comes to science. This is going to help resolve issues around the discussions around reinterment. So the question from Paramount Chief Steedman is valid and should be addressed. And I'm asking if you, Chairperson, can ask Renette Stander what happens in a situation like this now, where there is a policy, the policy is clear on this issue. This matter is very much within the ambit of the policy, but UCT is not cooperating. And I know the RRO office isn't being set up yet, so what happens? And perhaps Ms. Stander can also just clarify when the office will be operational. Thank you.
Can I go ahead?
Okay, Dr. Kasibe, if you don't mind, just keeping in the thread of it, if Ms. Stander just responds to that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. With regard to the DNA, usually it's a problem. And the reason is that a lot of communities feel that it's using another science on people. And therefore they don't want DNA. In this case, though, they do want DNA. The problem is the DNA is very expensive. So with regard to the policy basically indicates that DNA is admissible. We can use in DNA. But then communities must want DNA. So I agree with Charlene in this case that I don't know why DNA studies have not been done, but I agree with Charlene that if the DNA needs to be done, then it needs to be done, whether it's expensive or not. As I understand that the Northern Cape people have been done, DNA has been done on them. So it's only fair, in my opinion, to use the Eastern Cape to do the Eastern Cape people as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stander. Dr. Kasibe, you are next.
Yeah, thank you, Wilhelmina, and thanks to the panelists and everybody. Mine is just a quick one. I I won't really, I think, comment or ask questions regarding the UCT matter, because at some point I was at the heart of, of that controversy when I wanted to access, some of the, of the storage spaces there, and the access was not granted for me, and yet scientists continued to do their research, whilst some of us were not allowed to even get anywhere near that space. And that shows, I think, issues of who actually gets to be given access to ask different questions, and perhaps more uncomfortable questions. Speaks to the question of access and gatekeeping, because it is true that some people actually gatekeep, and that's what they do, and that's what they are, their profession allows them to do, that gatekeeping. And if you ask, come and pose different questions, uncomfortable questions, then you almost get boxed as a problem. But we are here to ask difficult questions, to critically examine all of these systems and processes that continue to recycle that system and structure of violence. But my issue now is around the question of policy, of the policy, which I have briefly, looked at. And I'm a bit concerned about some aspects that are highlighted, or that are reflected through the policy. For example, it still protects people to violate, the sacred human remains through this DNA testing and other forms of violations that, if one looks into it, in fact, we are recycling the same violence that has been institutionalized, during colonial times and apartheid times, to almost extract aspects of, aspects from these, unethically acquired human remains. There's also something about, ethically, collected human remains. I don't understand that concept that one, you can actually be allowed to do, extraction if the human remains were ethically collected. I don't understand what that means in the African context. And the second thing is, I'm interested in, why is it that in the policy, the policy mentions, I think, colonialism about 12 times and apartheid 8 times, but there's no mention of decolonization. And my understanding is that the issue of return and the issue of restitution, the issue of repatriation, it's a decolonial process. It's a decolonial project. And yet the policy does not even mention decolonization in the way that it is worded. Maybe I'm reading it incorrectly, but I just couldn't find it. And to me, that presents a much bigger problem, perhaps maybe a tip of a much bigger iceberg here. That if we talk about a process of decolonizing and the process of return and the process of undoing some of this violence that has been extended, or that has been extended to people who have been the recipients of such violence, we need to almost question even our very positionality as scientists, or as people who have given upon ourselves the right to analyze, but that very same right for others to do the analysis is actually not afforded to people who may actually come and ask different questions. So I am interested in, is there perhaps a reason why the policy does not even mention decolonization in its wording? Is there a specific reason? Is there perhaps maybe a what to call a resistance to mentioning the term decolonization in the way that the policy is worded? And why is it that aspects of the policy still protects, for example, the a violation of these human remains? And that, to me, is a very important question, because it determines whether or not we're making progress or we're taking a couple of steps back. Because if we're unable to undo and to ask these difficult questions, it means that we're actually using the policy to protect the very same kind of violence that actually that has been institutionalized for a very, very long time. And this is the reason why we're here, to almost ask these questions. This is why some of us are scholars, we are researchers, we are in museums, we deal with museological content all the time, and we've been dealing with it for a very long time. Some of us, we've published on these subjects, but the question is, are we really making that progress? Because it seems to me that, you know, we could actually be here for the next 10 years asking the very same questions, but the people who are gatekeeping the process are the very same people who are actually unable to, to even get close to where we're trying to get to. And the last question is the communities who are meant to be given access to the remains of their ancestors. How do we maximize that access if there are certain people who will not be allowed to access the human remains of their ancestors, and yet scientists actually have maximum access? They can do research and, or they can do whatever they feel like doing, but other people are not allowed to do the same. And that to me is also a problem. But I am interested really in this question of whether there is a reason why decolonization is not mentioned, is not reflected through the policy as a term, as a word, as in the way that the policy is worded. Maybe I'm not picking it up. Maybe somebody can identify it for me, but I just couldn't pick it up there in the policy. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Kasibe. I'm not sure who would like to reply to Dr. Kasibe. Okay, Ms. Tanda, I see your hand is up. And after you, I also see Mr. Urasib. Hand is up, okay. Ms. Tanda, you may go ahead.
Thank you. Dr. Kasibe, there's no particular reason that the word decolonization is not in the policy. It was just an oversight. Yeah, there's no, we're not against the word. It's nothing like that. So I do get your point that apartheid and colonization has been used a lot, and not decolonization. So, but as I said, there's no particular reason for that. Yeah, it's just an oversight. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ms. Tanda. And next we have Mr. Urasib.
My question is, I cannot understand. So the remains and like the decolonization process regarding this, how is it going to affect the whole Khoi community and not yet only just bloodlines? Because how many Khoi people want to have the dignity regarding this bone stuff? And also, it's not going to, because like I heard the Dr. Kasibe said about decolonization, yet it's not decolonized because it's like it's a one-way street process that is being done. Like I said, no, or not all Khoi people will have the same dignity that has been tried to be implemented regarding this current topic of discussion that we're having. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Urasib. Does anybody want to respond to that? Okay, Ms. Tanda, I see your hand is up.
Thank you. We are going to do inventories of human remains in museums as well as overseas. And that includes the Khoi people, because we are aware that there's a lot of Khoi people overseas, especially the remains of Khoi people. So the inventories will definitely include, obviously, it will include the Khoi people. And just like this is a national policy, so it affects everyone in the country. So basically, Khoi people, just as the other people, will be able to claim remains from the RRO, the Repatriation and Restitution Office, and then reburial, repatriation, reburial, etc., etc. So, but the Khoi people will definitely be able to benefit from this policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stander. Thank you, Mr. Rasib. Okay, then we have a comment. This was in the comment box, and this is from Mr. Jabbar Muhammad. So he says, thanks, Annalise, for your interesting presentation and beautiful pictures. How is this culture you mentioned active in South Africa? Active in South Africa. Are there any deaf in that culture? If yes, maybe bring that deaf person culture on board to make more awareness and respect this culture. Keep up your greatest work. Thank you, Jabbar. Okay, who would like to comment on that? That was directed at Annalise, yes, that question.
Hi, Wilhelmina. I actually did respond to him directly in the chat. So I don't know if it can be seen or if people actually want
Okay,
to.
I'm not sure. I don't think I can see that. Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
no, I can't see that.
okay, so I just told him that I have not come across any deaf people in the communities yet, but it's definitely something that I will take into consideration and be much more aware of. And so like I was actually thinking while the sign language interpreter was doing her job and Jeffrey was doing his poem. So I was like, how does she even translate what he's saying or just interpret what he's saying? So it's definitely something that I said we should take into consideration.
Thank you.
Could I assist in answering the previous question? Yeah, I think what the leader is bringing up is a very good point. And you know, when I to you know sort of and you say that the Khoi will benefit. Bearing in mind that, say, in Cape Town alone, the peninsula groups are specifically the Gore-Naikona, the Chorokhohwa, the Gore-Naikwa, the Kaikorana. And I think we need to start looking at, when we talk about the Khoi as benefiting, who exactly are we referring to here? Because when we establish that these sacred human remains were taken away unethically, and which communities they then must return to, you know, the specificity of who we're referring to, I think, is really important. And I think that you know, it is something that is going to require a particular kind of robust public participation, especially with the various Khoi and San communities in South Africa around this question, because each particular region has got definitive Khoi and San groups that have a footprint, but these you know, these footprints were also in many ways the territories shifted, you know, after the Khoimphetane that resulted of the First Frontier War in 1659. We would find movements of mass migration of different various Khoi groups at particular periods of time. The Olam find themselves then later in Namibia, and so forth. You know, the Nama have been moving in and around, you know, sort of these colonial borders. And I think one of the things that perhaps we need to look at is when we're dealing with the matter of Khoi and San, there should perhaps be some thinking of a particular kind of international policy, a regional policy, a Southern African policy that will actually do away with the particular colonial boundaries, because you cannot differentiate the San and the Khoi that's sitting in Namibia, Botswana, and Angola, you know, and the San and Khoi communities that are here. So, and remember, the repatriation process was usually done by similar colonial authorities, and they moved from Cape Town to Windhoek and around, and perhaps that requires some more careful thinking in as far as international relations is concerned. Perhaps this would be an opportunity for a regional sort of expatriation policy, because we can't only locate indigeneity when it comes to the San and Khoi to the colonial borders of what is today South Africa. I think that is very problematic. And so, you know, I just wanted to pose that as you know, as something perhaps that, you know, should be looked into. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. I see I have a comment here from Victoria, and she's inquiring about your beautiful poem. So her question is if it's published somewhere, or if you are able to share that with us.
It's not published. I suppose now that it is, seeing as I've spoken it here. So I suppose I can sign it off to Iziko as a Heritage Day gift. But certainly, I'm happy to share it with anybody who would like a copy of it. And you know, you're more than welcome to you know, to contact me. Thank you.
That would be wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. And I think I'm just looking at our time. I think we'll, yeah. So the last comment that we'll have will be from Ms. Houston. Okay, Ms. Houston, you may go ahead.
Thank you, Chairperson. Yeah, I just want to say, you know, that we must be careful of looking for trouble, or not trouble, but we look for fault sometimes where there's no fault, and we don't see opportunities sometimes where we have opportunities. I'm speaking now from the perspective of taking policies and using them to our best advantage. We won't see all our demands met at the same time. We won't get everything at one time. That's never how things work. It's about being strategic and tactical in achieving all of the goals that we have as people. But certainly this policy creates opportunity, there's no doubt about it, to bring healing and dignity, both to the dead and to the living. And in my experience working in these kinds of processes, specifically in reinterment processes, there's nothing stopping the community from being proactive. I've worked with communities who took the process, defined the process, managed to use the process for more than a reinterment process without turning it into a spectacle. So taking on board some of the concerns Mr. Jenkins raised, communities who've drawn on the wisdom of communities more stable than those here in the Cape by bringing Namibia closer, bringing Botswana closer, consulting with Uppington and so on. And this policy creates all of those possibilities. There's nothing stopping any of that from happening. And we do have a few precedents from the few reinterments that have taken place, where we've seen how communities, Khoi communities, have shaped the process, taking into account who they are, who we find ourselves to be in a modern day situation. So yeah, I think all these things do not happen at once, but there's no doubt about it that through us honoring our dead, in protected by this policy set out in this framework of repatriation and restitution, through us honoring our dead, we will also restore dignity and honor to the living. And this is something that the people have been asking for a long time.
Thank you for that, Ms. Houston. I think we will, conclude with that. So, from today's proactive discussion, there is much more work that needs to be done and many more open conversations needs to be had. As Iziko Archaeology Unit, we are proud to have been part of the many discussions, the engagements, and the hard work around the sensitive issue of human remains. We welcome this type of community-led discussion as it helps develop transformative practices in our museums. Please allow Dr. Bongani Ndlovu, Iziko Museums of South Africa, Executive Director of Core Functions, to thank all of you and to close the event. Over to you, Dr. Ndlovu.
Thank you, Program Director. Mine is a very simple job, and I'm happy that I'm doing vote of thanks. I can see the panelists sweating. That's because of the nature of engagement and also of the importance of the topic we're discussing today on Heritage Day. We do need to tackle these difficult questions, because if we avoid tackling them, we will not be able to move forward as a nation. And it is within this context that I would like to express our appreciations and thanks to all our panelists and contributors today. To Mr. Orisip, we thank you, sir, for reminding us and grounding us on the relevance and the importance of our heritage. You have used the language of the Nama people to foreground our language. Speakers and thinkers before us have reminded us that if we don't use our languages, we will lose much of our heritage. We will also not lose heritage, but our ability to conserve and our ability to contribute meaningfully to the economic development and social development of our country and of us as a people. We thank you for your provocation today. To Ms. Renate Stender, you have taken us through the policy process and you've highlighted to us what can be done using the policy as a tool to repatriate and restitute human remains, objects, and for us as South African as a people, I quote you, to find closure. That is a very important part of our heritage and history, trying to find closure. We know that finding closure is not an easy exercise. With closure, there will be reopening of wounds. And then also reopening of wounds, there are possibilities of differences, but we are not able to heal if those wounds are not addressed. And you've highlighted also that as part of the process, the policy, in addition to physical repatriation, it offers alternatives to that particular process, including memorialization and symbolic repatriation. I also like to thank the department. I know that this week, all of you have been very busy attending a series of meetings and workshops. And today you were able again to join us. We thank you and your colleagues in the department for allowing yourself to be engaged and also to be provoked. Please extend our appreciations to the DG and also to the DDG and all your colleagues in the department. We hope that we will continue to engage with you And as the speakers today have indicated, they would also like communities to be proactively involved in the repatriation process. Ms. Kotze, you focus the spotlight on the bones have spoken, and indeed the bones are speaking. Your emphasis was on community engagement and dealing with the difficult question of human remains. You've engaged with remains not as objects, but as individuals. You've used your exhibition as an example where you've tried to bring and spotlight the pains and the traumas suffered by those before us. You argued that by giving the people who were silenced their voices, we would be allowing the bones to speak. But we've also asked difficult questions that as experts, as academics, as general members of the public, you've asked a question: what authority do we have to speak for the bones? You've touched on a difficult question of community involvement, community consultation, and the role that we play as experts. And you've advised us and cautioned us to watch out for an opportunist. As we move forward, we will also be taking into account these words of wisdom. We thank you for your provocation today and your input. In her absence, Ms. Diana Faras gave us the gift. I have come home. I have come to take you home. That poem, as the CEO of Iziko indicated, was a catalyst that saw and initiated the return of the remains of Umama Sarah Batman. And in the poem I quote, our ancestor is home now, but there are bones in museums. And this is still a very sensitive issue, an issue that needs to be resolved. In the poem, she argues, the bones reappear. The bones have no fear. They are in our face. Never again inflict the pain. Through the language and the voice of Umama Faras, we can also see the presence of the bones today and the voice of the bones today. We thank her for her continued support to initiatives that attempt to address the question of human remains. To Ms. Robin Humphreys, again, you've used your research to indicate the importance of science and also the need for us to engage and listen to communities. You have looked how critically you've engaged with communities around Christchurch and how when they were not prepared to have their DNA tested, you did not push your agenda. To us, you've indicated the importance and the need to respond and respect communities. In your presentation, you've titled The Erased History of the Enslaved. And I like your focus and the use of the word enslaved. You've also pointed out that the center and the memorial continues to be a contested space today. And we hope that through that contestation, a middle ground will be found and reached. Through the lessons learned from the Prestige Street Rural Ground, we should be able to move forward as a nation. For me, to see the new voices today it was encouraging. We know that for the past few years, a number of us have been occupying this space, but we are seeing fresh voices, radical voices that are trying to disrupt the monotony. And we hope that this disruption will lead us to a better future. Ms. Charlene Houston, you've brought your experience and you've allowed us to engage with your wisdom today. You've looked at the policy formulation process and you've engaged with the presentation that Ms. Renate Stender gave earlier on. You've looked at the framework, the policy framework, and how we can use this framework in partnership with the communities to bring closure and dignity. And you say those are set of values that this policy brings to the fore. You argue that the policy creates an environment for partnerships with communities. You've re-emphasized the need also for spiritual repatriation and reburial. We know that you belong to the first, inverted commas, generation of heritage practitioners and officials who led a repatriation process and a reburial process. Yes, like any other process, there are shortcomings, but we're brave enough, working very closely with communities to tackle this difficult question. We thank you for that. To Mr. Jenkins, I like your provocation and also the emphasis on the sacredness of human remains and the need for us as we institute to work with communities. You've looked at how rituals are finding expressions in universities and the need, you argued, that there was a need for an open and flexible way of allowing communities to dictate how ceremonies should be performed. Your phrasing to dictate how ceremonies should be performed is central here, because for some time elsewhere, communities have not been given an opportunity to lead the process. You've pointed out that absent in the debate is a question and an acknowledgement of a genocide. And quite interestingly, 2 days ago, the president requested that the UN needed to prioritize the compensation around enslavement and slavery. And he was challenging European powers to consider that and to take it seriously. And we hope that as we discuss questions of dispossession, questions of genocide, that these issues will be tackled. The open discussion proved to us that there may be possibilities and a disconnect between the communities and us. A number of questions were raised regarding working with communities or consulting with communities or giving communities a lead. The discussions during the open discussion points out to possibilities and ruptures that remain or that may be the cause of fragmentations within communities and families. And these are issues that we need to also take seriously. Are we consulting communities? Are we working with communities? Or are we allowing the communities to take a lead? But most importantly, how do we work together to address the question of repatriation and restitution? Again, the question of gatekeeping, real or perceived, was raised. And the question of unethical collecting in Africa, whether it is African or un-African, and how and what do we consider ethical collecting of human remains or unethical collecting of human remains within the African context. And within this particular discourse, how do we therefore locate the question of human remains in museums within the decolonial discourse broadly. I would like to thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for your participation, for your meaningful engagement. And we hope that as we continue to engage with this difficult question, we will be able together as a country and as a people to work together and to find closure. On behalf of Iziko Museums of South Africa and all our partners, we thank you. Thank you.